All right, so in this tutorial video, we're going to look at creating a progressive house bass. We're going to make a nice synthy bass that would feel at home in a electro progressive tune or any other type of track where you require melodic synths for your breakdowns. You want them to take up a lot of the frequency range. So we'll just have a quick listen to the synth alone here. And I'm just going to play a pattern that I've created here. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. Some spatial effects, there's some delay, there's some distortions, there's detuning, unison, you name it, we're doing it in this patch. And it layers up really quite nicely. So let's start having a look at it. So to make this tone, we're going to use a few instances of Ableton's analog in conjunction. And we're going to do that because we're going to be using a lot of different oscillators with some very mild differences in tuning and some drastic differences in tuning to create a gigantic sound that stacks up really well when the filter is open, but still sounds big and fat when the filter is rolled down. And analog is a good choice for this just because it's got a lot of the features that we want and at the same time is very straightforward. It's also going to make us rely on some of Ableton's effects to get the results that we want. So it's a good choice for demoing this kind of sound because basically it means that everybody's going to have the same rough field of play to work with. So regardless of what synth you're using, these are techniques that are going to work for you. So let's start off by just pulling in an instance of analog here. And I'm going to immediately convert that to an instrument rack and pull in one more instance of analog. And we're just going to make our sub bass really quickly here. And again, our sub, we're going to choose our sine wave here, going to drop it down an octave, and that's going to be close to it. Let me just make sure that we've got it set to mono. And yep, that's going to do it for now. We're going to have a very simple sub to begin with. Oh, let me just adjust the amp envelope here. And I'm going to get rid of that release. There, that'll do. And I'm just going to roll that down in the mix a little bit. And I'm also just going to do some housekeeping stuff here. I'm just going to chuck my EQ8 on the end. And I'm just going to shave out some of the extreme lows here. So you can't even really hear much of a difference between the two signals, but we are just losing a couple of the extreme low frequencies there. I'm just going to make sure that I'm not losing anything that's super audible. Okay, I'm liking it around 60 hertz for now. Actually bring it down a little bit more. And we're just going to leave that. So I'm actually just going to deactivate it and we're just going to forget about it for now. So let's go back to this initial instance of analog here and we're going to set up a couple things and then save ourselves some time by copying this synth over. So to begin with, we're going to just activate filter 1 here. We're going to go for a 24 dB low pass. And I'm just going to get the filter envelope settings the way that I want. So I'm going to roll this down most of the way and introduce some envelope control. So we'll start with the maximum and then maybe roll it back depending on what we want. So let's just hear what this sounds like. I'm going to adjust the amp envelope again here. Okay, that's sounding pretty good for now. And I'm just going to put this into mono as well. And now we're just going to duplicate that. So now we've got two instances of analog doing the same thing with the same filter envelope and control, etc. So we're also going to be making use of our macros here. So I'm going to start off by expanding that so that we can see what we're working with. I want to have the filter be controlled by a macro, just in terms of its cutoff. I also want to have the filter envelope be controlled by a macro, and I also want to have the decay time controlled by a macro. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to have the filter envelope amount and decay time controlled by the same macro. So I'm going to go ahead and just map all of those quickly. And then we're going to need to go ahead and start range restricting these a little bit. So 15 seconds is going to be huge. Start with 133. And we're going to start with an audible envelope, so we'll start with 27 milliseconds. And we're going to want to take our frequency value for the envelope here and bring it to 0 to start with, because we don't want this going into the negative. And let's just have a listen to how that sounds. Okay, that's going to do for now. And let's also turn around and map both of our cutoff frequencies to macro 1 here. And again, we're going to want to start off with a useful value here. So we'll start with 363 and see how that goes. Okay, so we've got some values that we can play around with here. And I'm just going to quickly rename this. So that's going to be our filter envelope. And that's going to be our cutoff. And I'm just going to keep the cutoff open all the way while I work on this, because I want to hear what the full sound is like. This type of bass sound is actually all about filtering. It's all about having the filter open and the sense of anticipation that comes with a long building filter rise as you move towards this just gigantic sound with tons of action, tons of motion going on. And so we want to find out what that eventual sound is going to be like. We want to basically build from the top down. So we're going to create our goal, so to speak, and then we're going to dial it back into this kind of contained sound, which is what we're going to use for the majority of our bass hits. And then it's going to be all about building up towards this giant open filter sound. So now we're going to start stacking our oscillators up. And we're going to begin with this synth here, this first instance of analog. I'm going to activate the second oscillator. And I'm going to take this one and put it up 1 octave. And we're going to detune it a little bit. I'm going to detune this first oscillator a little bit too. And because we're only going to be using filter 1 here, I'm just going to take both oscillators and send them over to filter 1. So let's have a listen now. So we've got a much brighter sound now just from having that one oscillator up an octave, and we're getting a little bit of motion from the detuning there. So, and we'll listen to that alongside everything else. And we are starting to get a little bit of clipping there. So I'm just going to quickly chuck a utility on, and I'll just roll this down a little bit because we are going to be introducing a number of oscillators here. So next up, we're going to go along to our second instance of analog. And I'm going to be using this instance of analog to create some high-end harmonic content here, as well as give us a little bit of a chorded feel. So I'm going to take this oscillator 1 and bring it up 7 semitones here. And let's listen to those two alongside each other. So that's nice. And again, we're going to go all the way over to filter 1 there. Oscillator 2 is going to go to filter 1 as well. And we're going to put it up, we'll start with 3 octaves. That's too high, we'll go 2. And now we're going to try a couple different waveforms here. Let's switch those over to pulse waves. And I'm going to apply a little bit of LFO modulation to the pulse width here. So pop back into the oscillator section. And so we're going to use the noise generator from this first instance of analog here. I'm going to put that all the way through filter 1, and we're just going to bring it up into the mix a little bit. Okay, that sounded good. And I'm going to pop back, and I'm actually feeling like we've got a little bit too much going on in the high end here. So I'm going to take that second oscillator and bring it down 1 octave. And what we're going to do is we're going to take oscillator 2 here, and we're going to high pass it before it goes into the low pass filter. But we're not going to apply the same process to oscillator 1. So we're going to switch oscillator 1 over to filter 2. We're going to feed filter 1 to filter 2, and we're going to activate filter 2. Now we're going to switch that over to high pass. Switch filter 2 over to the low pass 24. I'm just going to quickly unmap this and remap it over here. There. So all of our mappings are essentially reset there. So now we're going to have oscillator 2 going through filter 1 to filter 2. And we're going to have oscillator 1 going directly to filter 2. And we're just going to have to activate that amp stage, bring the sustain up, the release down, and I'm going to deactivate the amp on filter 1. So now filter 1 is not sounding without sending its output through filter 2 first. So I'm just going to solo this so we can find a nice balance here. And to begin with, we're going to work with oscillator 2 here, just to try and get some nice high-end harmonic content going on. Okay, I'm actually liking that. And let's add a little bit of noise in here as well. Again, going to filter 1. All right, now we'll activate oscillator 1 again. Okay, that's sounding good. And let's listen to this all in conjunction. Okay, so we've got a nice balance of waves here, and we're going to do a couple more things before we start reprogramming the filter section a little bit. The one thing I'm going to do is, because this is essentially our instance of analog that's providing the ancillary content, as in it's not the main body of the sound like this one. We're going to solo this, and I'm going to apply some unison to it. So let's bring that up a little bit. Maybe a little bit too much. There we go. And we'll leave that at 2 voices of unison there. And so overall, we've got a nicely balanced out oscillator section here. And I just realized I've got a little bit of extra release time. And that must be coming from synth 1 here. So, and I'm just going to drop the volume a little bit. So let's bring our sub in and listen to all 3 together. Now, we're going to have to start balancing out our oscillators. So we're going to start with our main instance of analog here. And let's bring in the second instance. and that's a little bit too high, so I'm going to bring it down. Okay, and we'll bring in our sub now. Now I'm finding that the sub is now dipping a little bit too far. I'm just gonna try this actually 1 octave up again. Okay, so the sub actually works a little bit better 1 octave up, but I feel like we're gonna lose some of our low end there. So I'm gonna utilize a little bit of a trick here. I'm gonna pop this back down 1 octave again, and then I'm gonna go back to the oscillator section in our first instance of analog, and I'm going to introduce a little bit of the sub oscillator in analog. And this is just an extra oscillator that's going to give us a little bit more body here. So I'm just going to bring that up a little bit. Actually, I'll solo it and bring it up a little bit so we can hear specifically what's happening. You can hear a little bit of growl coming in there. And now we'll listen to these together. It's a much bigger sound overall. Bring it down a little bit. And now all three together again. We might be getting a little bit too much noise off the second one. There we go. Okay, so we've got some really nice signal coming off those three synths at the moment. So we're going to leave it there for a sec, and we're going to start warming up our initial instance of analog here. We're just going to start applying a little bit of saturation and a couple spatial effects to it and the second instance of analog that's providing our top end here. So after A/Bing this on my studio monitors at a little bit of a higher volume here, decided I am actually going to pop that sub back up 1 octave. It's just taking up a little bit too much in the low range. It's not really providing as much body as I'd like. So we're going to have a listen to it again now that it's back up 1 more octave. Yeah, and it's definitely just doing more for us at that point. That's one of the things is when you're designing a complex sound like this, you have to keep on flipping back and forth between different configurations of oscillators, trying to get the balance that you want between everything. And there's certain points where you find that what you've done already doesn't necessarily work once you add the next thing in. So it's constantly a process of basically chipping away at the sound and rearranging the sound to get everything to sit correctly. And so now that we've got that going, it's time to, as I said, warm up these two instances of analog. I'm going to take a look at using one of the drive parameters that exists in analog already, and that's under the filter section. And I'm going to try these symmetrical drive functions here. So and the asymmetrical, start with 1. Okay. I think what we're going to do is we're going to use a little bit of the symmetrical drive, and we're going to bring a little bit of resonance into the mix. And we're also going to add a saturator after the output of this instance of analog. So we're just going to pop in the chain there. And we're going to go for sinoid fold. I'm going to introduce just a little bit of drive here and pull back on it in the wet dry. And I really like balancing out using a bit more drive than I normally would with the wet dry knob, because basically at that point you're able to get a harsher distortion and less of it, and that's something that I've mentioned before already. It's definitely a nice thing to be able to add to your sound design. So let's listen now. And we're going to see if we can get it to accent a little bit more in the low range here just by using some of the color variations. Okay, that is definitely doing it for me. Quite big now. So next up, we're going to add an instance of EQ8. And because we've got a sub covering the low range, I'm going to just shave out some of the extreme lows in this patch. And I'm also going to try and get a little bit of a spatial effect going on here. So I want to use just a tiny amount of delay, and I'm just going to be using it to make the sound come alive in the stereo field. So let's start with the simple delay and see how that goes. So I'm going to place that after the EQ8. That way we're not getting any kind of delay signal picking up on those low frequencies. And we're just going to start off with it totally dry, a little bit of feedback. I'm going to take it off of sync and put it in time mode and then pull the time all the way down. So let's listen without. And we can hear there's just a little bit of harmonic content that's coming from that that's just adding to the overall sound. Cool. So I think that's going to be it for that instance of analog. Now let's listen to all three again. And I'm finding that this instance of analog is just a little bit woody for me right now. That's actually a characteristic that can come from using these pulse waves. So I'm just going to switch it back to sawtooth and see if I prefer that. Yeah, I do actually. So we're just going to add, again, a saturator to the output of this instance of analog. And in this case, I think what we're actually going to do is just use the A Bit Warmer preset. Yep, that's going to do it. And we're going to use, again, simple delay. Put it into time mode, bring down the wet dry, bring up the feedback a little bit. And we're going to go a little bit longer on the delay times because this top end synth is really just providing accent and motion and just adding extra harmonic content to what we're getting from that main analog instance. So I'm just going to try bringing the wet dry up here and we'll see whether we like what we hear. A little bit long on this side. Okay. And I'm bringing it down a little bit. So we're getting a nice metallic sheen there. And I'm probably also going to introduce a little bit of, we'll probably start with phaser and maybe try the flanger instead. And I'm going to put this before the distortion in the chain. And again, we're going to start with it dry. Okay, and a little bit of LFO. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to minimize all these. And we're going to go back and listen to all three in conjunction one more time. So that is now a fairly monstrous sound. That's got a lot going on. And I'm actually just going to detune these two oscillators a little bit as well. Not going to do a huge amount, but a little bit. Okay, cool. Now remember we switched over our filters on this second instance of analog here from using the low pass on filter 1 to using the 2 in series. So I'm just going to go and make sure that I'm using the right settings here. We're going to go for 0 so it's not going into the negative in terms of polarity. And we're going to bring the filter envelope up so it coincides with the other filter envelope. And going to what, 133? Cool. And we'll switch off of map mode now, and we're going to start actually playing around with this. So we're going to bring the cutoff down. And okay, so I'm just going to program a really quick pattern here. So I've dialed up a fairly simple pattern here, which we're just going to have a quick listen to. Okay, and I'm quite liking that overall sound. But I've decided on something else which we're just going to need to adjust here. And that's I'm going to bounce my sub over into a separate instrument rack. So I'm going to turn that into a instrument rack here so that we have a nested rack, and this is our container rack here. And I'm just going to create a chain and drag that instance of analog into the chain. So now we've got our two instances in this instrument rack and this instance in this instrument rack, and we're just going to shut that guy down and ignore him for now. We're going to go back to this instance, which is now just our main analog synth and our top end. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add an audio track, and I'm just going to put an instance of DubStation on it. DubStation's a delay that I absolutely love. And I'm going to go and grab our ins outs. I'm going to take the audio from our instrument rack that contains our two instances of analog, and I'm going to take it post effects, set this to monitor in. So now we'll have a delay signal on here. Now, because I've actually got the synth's output already, I'm going to need to put that to wet 100%. And after this, I'm going to put a compressor, and I'm going to activate its sidechain in, and I'm going to grab the input from kick on the drum rack. So at this point, what we're going to have is our instrument rack is going to be generating its overall signal, and then one of the nested instrument racks within the containing rack is going to be sending its output to this audio track here, which is set to monitor in, so it's just listening for any signal coming from that instrument rack. It's passing it through DubStation, and then I have a sidechain compressor, which is going to compress DubStation's output. And that's going to give us a nice kind of swimmy effect. It's going to create a lot of ambience. So I'm just going to start this up, and we're going to play with some settings and find something we like here. There we go. That's starting to provide some of what we're after. We've got a lot of regen going on there, so that's basically our feedback. I'm just going to bring that down a little bit, and we're going to leave those settings as is right now. One thing I do want to do for sure is I'm going to add an instance of EQ8 in here, and I'm going to get rid of all of the low frequencies out of that delay. That way it's providing some swimmy top end, but that's about it. Okay, so that's working well. And now we're just going to play around with our cutoff and filter envelope. that works quite well. And obviously, you can go a lot harder with your distortions and your spatial effects and so on. But I find that this is a really nice system for creating these types of progressive house basses. When you layer your synths up like this and then take part of the output and put it through a spatial effect and sidechain the output of that spatial effect, then you get this really nice flowy ambient texture. And by choosing wisely what you add to your macros in the instrument rack, you can really create an effect that's very expressive and controllable and gives you predictable results throughout your tune. That way you're really just controlling your macros within a certain range as opposed to having to deal with a ton of different things to automate in your automation channels. So yeah, those are the basics of creating a progressive house bass using a few instances of analog.